A wild Mustang fights the merciless floodwaters, muscles burning with every desperate stride. No one thought he would make it, but then against all odds, a former Marine appeared. What happened next will shock you. This is a story of redemption, healing, and the spark of an unexpected bond. The sky churned a violent grey, with swollen clouds pressing down on the rugged expanse of Wyoming's wilderness. The air tasted of rain and earth, heavy with the scent of pine and raw fear. The wind howled through the canyons, dragging leaves, and grit into chaotic spirals, as if the very land were bracing for war. Mason Smith stood alone by the river's edge, his broad shoulders cloaked in a worn canvas jacket, hands shoved deep into his pockets. His eyes, pale and hollow like smoke, tracked the surging current. The world had been quiet for him these days, purposefully so. Silence was a refuge, a space where the ghosts couldn't claw their way in. But the silence was about to be broken. The first sound was not the thunder, though the sky grumbled with impatient fury. It wasn't even the sudden crack of a tree branch, giving way under the strain of the wind. It was something rawer, deeper, a frantic splashing, a strangled whinny, cut sharp with desperation. Mason's gaze snapped to the source. At first, it was just a dark blur thrashing violently in the churning water. Then the shape took form, sleek muscles rippling under a soaked ash-grey coat. A Mustang, wild, proud, and utterly powerless against nature's fury. His nostrils flared wide, eyes wide and rimmed with white terror, fighting to keep his head above the floodwaters. The river didn't care about pride or strength. It wanted to claim everything. Mason's breath hitched. He should have turned away, should have let it be. Nature was cruel, and interfering often made things worse. But that wasn't the real reason. No, the real reason was the old fear coiling in his chest, that lead-heavy voice whispering, "You couldn't save them then. What makes you think you can now?" The images rushed back, flashes of smoke, the searing heat of flames licking at walls, the weight of bodies too broken to move. His heart clenched with the phantom grip of memories that never loosened. But then the Mustang's eyes met his. For the briefest second, there was recognition in that wild gaze, not of who Mason was, but of what he was. A survivor, a being hanging by a thread, unwilling to let go. Mason moved before logic could stop him. His boots pounded against the muddy bank as he tore off his jacket, stripping himself down to bare essentials. The cold hit him like a slap, sharp and merciless, but the floodwaters would be colder. Without hesitation, he plunged into the chaos. The shock was instant and brutal, icy fingers gripping his chest, stealing the breath from his lungs. The river pulled at him greedily, dragging him under, but years of training kicked in. His arms cut through the water, muscles screaming in protest as he fought the current. "Hold on." Mason's voice was raw, but the Mustang couldn't understand. Words, only the fire behind them. The stallion thrashed harder as Mason closed the distance, his powerful body tiring against the relentless force of the river. The first touch was electric, Mason's hand brushing against the slick muscle of Spirit's neck. The Mustang jerked violently, nearly throwing them both under, but Mason held firm. "Easy, easy, boy. I've got you." It was a lie. He didn't have him. Not yet. A jagged branch shot toward them in the water's chaos, and Mason barely managed to shove it aside. His arms burned, lungs screamed for air, but the fire inside roared louder. "You won't die here." "Neither of us will." Spirit was trembling, the raw panic in his eyes starting to give way to something else. Exhaustion. The stallion's strength was fading, muscles quivering with every futile movement. Mason knew that feeling. He had been there, ready to let go because the fight just hurt too damn much. "Not today," Mason growled through gritted teeth. Looping one arm around the Mustang's powerful neck, he kicked harder than he ever had in his life. The weight of the horse was immense, nearly impossible, but raw will had carried Mason through wars hotter than hell. It would carry him now. The bank was close, too close for failure. Each stroke was a battle, the current determined to drag them both under. The weight of regret bore down on Mason, heavy as the river itself. You couldn't save your team, but maybe you can save him. With a final, desperate push, his feet found purchase in the sucking mud of the riverbank. Every muscle screamed as he hauled Spirit out of the water, collapsing onto the cold, wet earth with a ragged gasp. The Mustang's chest heaved with labored breaths, sides trembling like a collapsing mountain. His eyes rolled, wide with confusion and fear, but alive. Mason lay beside him, water streaming from his hair, every fiber of his being spent. The world around them was eerily silent now, the flood's fury retreating into the distance like a defeated beast. Minutes passed, long, stretching moments of shared exhaustion. Then, something unexpected happened. The Mustang, this wild creature of muscle and instinct, turned his head, pressing his muzzle against Mason's shoulder for the briefest second. A silent acknowledgement, not gratitude, something deeper, connection. Mason's eyes burned, not from the cold, but from something raw and human that he hadn't let himself feel in years. Maybe saving him isn't what this is about, Mason thought, staring up at the dark sky. Maybe it's about saving myself. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the storm's rage subsiding into an eerie stillness. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and pine, heavy but cleansing, as if the wilderness itself had paused to witness this fragile, unexpected bond. And for the first time in years, Mason didn't feel completely alone. The rain eased into a steady drizzle, and the wind softened to a whisper, rustling through the pines like a secret not meant to be heard. Mason sat on the cold, wet ground, every muscle aching, his heart pounding a relentless rhythm in his chest. The Mustang, this wild, battered spirit of the land, lay beside him, sides rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. For a long moment, neither moved. The weight of survival pressed down on them both. Mason didn't know what to do next. His instincts, those drilled into him from years in the Marines and the fire department, urged him to assess injuries, stabilize, create a plan. But this wasn't a battlefield or a burning building. This was something raw, older. It was just them now, two beings, broken in their own ways, clutching to survival by threads frayed too thin. The Mustang's eyes fluttered, half-closed, and Mason could see it now. Blood, dark and sticky, matted into the stallion's side. A deep gash tore across Spirit's flank, likely from debris in the current. His legs trembled every time they tried to move, and Mason knew exhaustion wasn't the only enemy here. "Okay, buddy, you've got fight in you," Mason murmured, his voice barely more than a breath against the wind. "But we need to get you out of this rain. You're gonna freeze out here." The words weren't for the horse's understanding, they were for him. A reminder that action was necessary. Movement meant survival. For both of us. Slowly, Mason rose on unsteady legs. Pain radiated through his arms and back, every joint screaming protest from the rescue. But pain was familiar. He could manage. Pain. It was the silence. The stillness afterward that always broke him. The Mustang watched him cautiously, those wild eyes reflecting the dull silver of the overcast sky. Mason took a step forward, then crouched low, making himself small. "No. Sudden moves. You've been through hell. You don't need fear right now. Easy now." "I'm not gonna hurt you," Mason whispered, reaching out a hand. His palm hovered near Spirit's muzzle, waiting. The horse didn't pull away but didn't lean in either, just stared, breath shallow but steady. The connection wasn't trust yet. It was recognition, a fragile thread woven from shared suffering. Mason knew of a small abandoned ranger station not far from here, tucked deep into the woods. It wasn't much, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was shelter. If he could get Spirit, moving they might stand a chance, but leading a wild horse, especially one injured and frightened, was near impossible. Yet here they were. Impossible had already been defied. "Come on, let's try," Mason murmured. His voice was low and steady, the same tone he used when pulling people from burning buildings, anchored in certainty even when everything inside was chaos. He moved slowly, positioning himself alongside. The horse's flank. With deliberate care, Mason placed a gentle hand on Spirit's neck. The stallion flinched but didn't pull away. A good sign. His muscles, tense and coiled like steel springs, began to relax under Mason's touch. "Atta, boy, you're stronger than this river." Stronger than all this damn pain. Spirit's ears twitched as if listening. Mason didn't know what Spirit understood, only that words didn't matter as much as presence. With effort, Spirit shifted his weight, struggling to rise. Mason was there instantly, bracing the horse's massive body, offering what little support his tired frame could provide. Every inch of movement was a battle, a trembling step forward, then another. Progress was slow, agonizing even, but it was progress. The trek toward the ranger station was grueling. The rain had turned the earth to thick, sucking mud, and every step threatened to pull Mason down with it. Spirit stumbled more than once, legs nearly buckling from exhaustion and pain. Each time Mason was there, whispering quiet encouragements, keeping them both moving. The wilderness was alive with sounds. Branches creaked under the weight of rain. Distant calls of unseen birds echoed through the trees, and every so often, the distant rumble of the river reminded them of its lingering threat. By the time the ranger station came into view, night had begun to fall, staining the sky in bruised purples and deep grays. The station was a ghost of its former self, weather-beaten wood, a door that hung on rusted hinges, and a chimney that hadn't seen smoke in years. But it was shelter. They stumbled into the clearing, both man and horse barely standing. Mason led Spirit beneath the narrow overhang of the porch, offering a dry spot from the relentless drizzle. The Mustang collapsed onto the cold wooden boards, sides heaving from exhaustion. Mason didn't let himself rest yet. Inside the station he found what little remained, old brittle firewood in the corner and a rusted metal stove. His hands worked on instinct, gathering kindling, striking a spark with an old flint he'd carried since his Marine days. The fire crackled weakly to life, throwing faint light across the dim room. Mason returned to Spirit's side with a worn blanket he found in a forgotten cabinet. He couldn't do much for the wound, not yet, but he could keep the horse warm. Draping the blanket across Spirit's powerful shoulders, Mason sat beside him, the fire's glow reflecting in the stallion's dark, wary eyes. "I don't know why I did it," Mason admitted into the silence. His voice was low, almost unsure, as if speaking the truth might crack something inside him. "I haven't tried to save anything or anyone in a long time." The Mustang's breathing was still shallow, but his eyes never left Mason's. "I used to think saving people was who I was. Marine firefighter hero, they called me." Mason laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in the cold night air. "But that night, the fire, I couldn't get them out. My team. They trusted me to bring them home, and I failed." The confession bled out into the silence like smoke from the fire, slow, curling, inevitable. "But here you are," Mason whispered, looking down at Spirit. "Maybe you don't need saving. Maybe you're just like me, tired of fighting, but too damn stubborn to stop." The Mustang shifted, resting his head on the wooden floor with a heavy sigh, as if acknowledging the truth in Mason's words. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind still whispered through the trees, but here, within these fragile walls, there was peace. A fragile, fleeting peace built not from understanding but from shared survival. Mason leaned back, his body aching, exhaustion pulling at his consciousness. But sleep didn't come easily. His thoughts drifted to the past, the smoke, the screaming, the crushing guilt that had driven him into isolation. Yet now, lying beside this wounded creature, something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Hope. The he. Kind that didn't roar like the river or crash like a wildfire. It was quiet, fragile, a seed buried deep in the cold ground, waiting for a reason to grow. And in that cold, forgotten ranger station, as the fire burned low and the rain softened, to a gentle murmur, Mason realized something profound. For the first time in years, he didn't want to be alone anymore. Morning broke not with the soft light of dawn, but with a grey, heavy sky that hung low, pressing against the earth like a weight neither man nor beast could shrug off. The rain had slowed to a mist, clinging to the air with cold, damp fingers. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only the faintest glow in the shadowed corners of the ranger station. Mason stirred first, his body stiff and sore from the night spent on the wooden floor. Every muscle felt like it had been wrung dry, his shoulders aching from the strain of pulling Spirit from the river and the endless hours of guiding him through the wilderness. Yet the ache was different. It was not the hollow, gnawing emptiness of defeat, but the deep burn of effort made for something that mattered. His eyes found Spirit lying close to the fire's remnants, the worn blanket still draped across the Mustang's powerful shoulders. The wound along Spirit's flank had dried some, though the raw edges of torn flesh were a reminder of how close the stallion had come to being lost. His breathing was shallow but steadier now, and there was a flicker of clarity in his dark eyes, a distant spark that had not been there the night before. Mason moved slowly, cautious not to startle him. His hand reached out, palm open, resting just inches from Spirit's muzzle. The horse's nostrils flared, taking in Mason's scent. Cautious, still wild at heart, but not as wary as before. Mason stayed still, allowing Spirit the choice. A heartbeat. Then another. And then Spirit shifted, pressing his muzzle lightly against Mason's hand. It wasn't trust yet. It was something simpler but no less powerful. Acceptance. "Good boy," Mason murmured, voice low and rough from sleep and disuse. "You're still fighting, that's what matters." Outside, the mist clung to the pine trees, wrapping the forest in a veil of silver. The sound of dripping water echoed from every branch and leaf. Mason turned toward the cracked window, gaze distant. He wasn't sure how long they could stay. Here. The flood had likely cut off trails, and Spirit wouldn't survive out here if that wound festered. "You need to get him help," Mason told himself, but the idea of leaving the safety of the station, this tiny, fragile bubble of quiet, made his chest tighten. The world beyond was chaos. Noise. The kind of noise that echoed with memories of screams, smoke, and failure. But looking at Spirit's injury, Mason knew staying was not an option. "All right," he sighed, dragging himself to his feet. His legs protested every movement, joints stiff from cold and exhaustion. "We're gonna have to move. I can't fix that gash with just willpower and a damn blanket." There was an old medical kit tucked away in one of the ranger station's rusted cabinets, bandages, antiseptic, supplies long expired but better than nothing. Mason worked in silence, his hands steady from years of muscle memory. Cleaning the wound wasn't easy. Spirit flinched with every touch, muscles rippling beneath torn skin, but Mason whispered soft reassurances, voice calm and sure, even when his own heart hammered with anxiety. "I know it hurts," Mason muttered as he applied a makeshift bandage, "but pain means you're still alive, still fighting." The same words had once been spoken to him in a hospital bed, weeks after the fire that had taken his team. At the time, those words had felt like a curse, a reminder of his failure. But now, binding the Mustang's wounds, they felt different. Maybe survival wasn't the curse. Maybe it was the second chance he never wanted, but somehow needed. When the makeshift bandage was secured, Mason leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow. Spirit lay still, watching him with tired eyes, the bandage wrapped around his flank like a battle scar. "Yeah," Mason breathed. "You'll be all right." The silence that followed was almost comforting. Two survivors sitting in the aftermath of chaos, neither needing to speak to understand the weight the other carried. But survival wasn't enough. Mason stood and looked out through the broken window. The mist was clearing, thinning as the wind picked up again. In the distance, through the veil of pine trees, he could see the faint outline of the trail leading west. That path could take them toward civilization, toward help. But it was going to be a hard journey. "Okay, Spirit," Mason said, turning back toward the stallion. "We're going to get you home. I don't know where that is for you, but I'll get you there. And maybe, just maybe, I'll find my way too." It took the better part of an hour to coax Spirit to his feet again. Every movement was a struggle for the Mustang. His legs trembled beneath his weight, and each step was hesitant. But Spirit didn't give up. There was no anger, no defiance, only determination carved deep into every muscle and breath. They moved together, slow, steady, deliberate. Mason didn't try to lead with force. Instead, he stayed by Spirit's side, offering quiet encouragements and steady presence. Every step forward felt like a small victory. The wilderness around them was eerily quiet as they moved down the trail. The aftermath of the storm left the land waterlogged, mud sucking at their feet and hooves. The scent of wet earth and pine sap filled the air, mingling with the faint copper tang of blood. Hours passed in silence. The trail was treacherous, roots snaked beneath the mud, threatening to trip them with every step, and jagged rocks jutted out like teeth from the earth. But Spirit didn't falter, and neither did Mason. The sun was sinking low behind the trees when they found it, a shallow stream, the water clear and cold, untouched by the muddy fury of the flood. Mason let Spirit drink, watching the stallion's trembling body with a mixture of relief and dread. They were making progress, but it wasn't enough. Spirit needed real help, soon. As the sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, Mason set up a small camp by the stream. He didn't have much. No tent, no gear, just the lingering warmth of the fire's memory from the night before and the stubborn will to keep going. He sat beside Spirit as the Mustang rested, his hand resting gently on the horse's neck, feeling the slow, steady pulse beneath skin and muscle. In the quiet of the wilderness, surrounded by the dying light and the endless trees, Mason finally allowed himself a moment to feel, not the crushing guilt or the endless ache of loss, but something, softer hope. It wasn't loud. It didn't roar like the river or crash like the storm. It was a whisper, fragile and uncertain but present nonetheless. As darkness settled over them and the first stars blinked into existence above, Mason made a promise, one he wasn't sure he could keep but had to try. "I won't leave you behind," he whispered to Spirit, voice rough and raw, "not like I did before." And in that cold, vast wilderness, with only the stars and the gentle breath of the wind for company, Mason felt something break open inside him. Not pain, not regret, but the beginning of something far more terrifying. Healing. Dawn broke gently. Across the horizon, a soft spill of gold that bled into the sky, pushing away the heavy grey of the last few days. The forest stirred awake around them, the chirp of unseen birds, the rustle of wind through pine needles and the faint trickle of water from the nearby stream, steady and pure. Mason sat beside Spirit, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but alive with a focus he hadn't felt in years. The fire of survival still burned low in his chest, but now it was fed by something stronger than instinct, purpose. Spirit slept uneasily, his sides rising and falling in labored breaths, the rough bandage still tight around his flank. The wound wasn't bleeding anymore, but infection was a real threat. Mason knew they didn't have much time. He'd spent so long running from the world, shutting himself off from every reminder of what he'd lost. His team, his brothers, every life that had trusted him and been failed by his hands. But here in the wilderness, beside this battered Mustang who had survived against all odds, Mason felt something different stir within him. You saved him, and maybe you can save yourself too, with the rising sun casting light on their broken trail. Mason made a decision. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about getting Spirit to safety. No more waiting. No more resting. They had to move. The journey was relentless. The trail ahead was brutal, cutting through thick underbrush, winding through narrow passes where the earth had crumbled from the flood's fury. Every step was a battle, spirits, strength waning, and Mason's body worn raw from days of exhaustion and the weight of responsibility. But neither gave up. Mason talked to Spirit as they moved, not just commands, but steady, grounding words. Stories of the Marines, stories of his firehouse days, of the brothers he'd lost and the memories that haunted him. It wasn't for Spirit's understanding. It was Mason's way of releasing the pain that had caged him for so long. And Spirit listened, ears twitching with every word, his tired eyes locking with Mason's whenever doubt threatened to pull him under. There was something in the stallion's gaze, an understanding beyond words, as if Spirit carried his own weight of unspoken sorrow, and knew exactly what it meant to keep walking when every muscle screamed to quit. They were the same in that way, scarred, tired, but still moving. By the third day, Mason knew they were close. The map in his memory told him of a small veterinary outpost along the valley trail, a place where ranchers brought their injured livestock for care. If they could just make it there, Spirit might have a chance, but nature didn't care about desperation. Late that afternoon, as they neared the clearing that would take them toward the valley, the skies turned violent again. The wind picked up. First, cold and sharp like knives against the skin. Then the rain came harder, faster than before, slamming against the earth with renewed fury. Mason cursed under his breath, pulling Spirit close beneath a thick cluster of pines for shelter. The rain pounded around them, and the wind howled like a beast unchained. But it wasn't the storm that made Mason's heart sink. It was Spirit. The stallion's body trembled violently, legs folding beneath him as he collapsed into the mud. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, each exhale weaker than the last. The infection was taking hold faster than Mason had feared. No, no, no. Come on, Spirit. Don't quit on me now. Mason knelt beside him, his hands pressing against the Mustang's neck, feeling the weak pulse beneath his skin. You're stronger than this. You survived the river. You survived everything. The storm raged, but Mason didn't feel the cold anymore. His focus was on Spirit, on the life slipping away beneath his hands. Please, Mason whispered, voice cracking. I can't lose you. Not after everything we've been through. Spirit's eyes fluttered open, just barely. There was no wild fear in them now, only exhaustion, and something that felt terrifyingly close to acceptance. Mason shook his head violently. No, you don't get to give up. I know what it's like to want to let go, believe me, I know. But you're not alone anymore. I'm here. I see you. The rain pounded down harder, but the moment between them felt like a bubble of stillness, a fragile heartbeat in the chaos. And then Mason felt it. Spirit's pulse, weak but steady, thumped beneath his hand. That was enough. I'm getting you out of here, Mason whispered, gripping the makeshift rope he'd fashioned as a lead. We're going to make it. With every ounce of strength he had left, Mason helped Spirit back onto his feet. The stallion swayed dangerously, but he didn't fall. His legs, though trembling, found their balance. The wildfire in his eyes wasn't gone. It was just dimmed, waiting for the right moment to burn bright again. Mason guided Spirit through the storm, every step a battle against the wind and exhaustion. Time lost meaning. It was just the next step and then the next until the forest finally broke open into a clearing. And there it was, a small cabin, light spilling from its windows, smoke curling from the chimney. A beacon in the storm. Mason nearly collapsed from relief. He staggered toward the outpost, dragging Spirit alongside him. Before he could reach the door, it flew open, and a tall woman with sharp eyes and weathered hands stood in the doorway. What the hell? She started, then her eyes landed on Spirit. Get them inside now. The next moments blurred together, a rush of movement, warmth, hands guiding Spirit into a stable, fresh bandages replacing the old ones, and voices speaking words Mason couldn't hold on to. He didn't remember falling asleep. Mason woke up to the warmth of a fire and the quiet hum of life around him. His body ached, but it wasn't the crushing exhaustion of survival. It was the heaviness that came after a burden had finally been lifted. The woman, her name was Claire, sat nearby, a steaming mug in hand. You're lucky, both of you. That horse should have died out there. Mason swallowed hard. But he didn't. Claire nodded slowly. No, he didn't. Mason stood, despite the protest in his legs, and moved toward the window that overlooked the stable. There, lying in the hay, was Spirit, bandaged, resting but alive. His chest rose and fell with slow, steady breaths. A rush of emotion hit Mason, sudden and overwhelming. Relief, exhaustion, and something deeper. Gratitude. Days passed. Spirit grew stronger, and so did Mason. Every morning he sat by the stallion's side, brushing his coat, whispering stories of a life once lived, a life that had been buried beneath guilt and silence for too long. One morning, as the sun broke over the mountains, Mason opened the stable door, letting the warm light spill in. Spirit stood on trembling legs, stronger now, eyes burning with that wild fire once more. Mason approached slowly, hand outstretched. Spirit didn't hesitate. The Mustang stepped forward, pressing his muzzle into Mason's palm. Not just acceptance, not just survival, trust. Mason swallowed the lump in his throat. "You're free now, Spirit. You don't owe me anything." The Mustang didn't move. Mason let out a shaky breath. "I think maybe neither of us was ever meant to be alone." Weeks later, beneath a sky clear and endless, Mason watched as Spirit ran across the open field, each stride powerful, graceful, free. The stallion's coat caught the sunlight, every muscle rippling with strength and resilience. Mason didn't call him back. He knew this moment wasn't about holding on, it was about letting go, not in loss, but in release. And as Spirit disappeared, into the horizon, a wild spirit finally free, Mason stood tall. The wilderness had taken so much from him, but it had also given him something back. Redemption, healing, hope. Mason turned toward the trail, the wind brushing against his face, carrying the scent of pine and earth. For the first time in years, the road ahead didn't feel like an escape. It felt like home. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.